Hey guys, it's Luke Johnson from Noetic, the philosophy, poetry, humanities teaching app. Tonight I had a wonderful discussion with CJ Eller about Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. It was a really illuminating discussion. Unfortunately, the first 5 minutes of the audio got corrupted. There's something going on with my computer that I need to get checked out. So there were a few points that I wanted to include in regards to background information and to kind of set the stage for the nature of our conversation. So I won't waste any time. Let's just get right into it. From Wikipedia, what you need to know about this title, The Death of the Author, is it's a bit of a pun based off of Sir Thomas Malory's compilation of Arthurian legends from the 15th century. The title of that is Les Morts d'Arthur. I don't speak French, so hopefully I didn't butcher it too badly there. And what you need to know about Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author is that it first appeared in English. It's an essay that first appeared in English in an American journal called Aspen, and I believe that happened somewhere around 1967. I think a year later it came out in French. If you're following along at home or something like that, you most likely have it within an anthology of Barthes' essays called Image-Music-Text. I would imagine that those hyphens are not arbitrary, that he's probably trying to make some sort of point with that, but I don't know enough about this book to say anything substantive about it. All I'll say about what we're trying to do over here at Noetic is that originally Noetic started off as just a philosophy teaching app, and as I saw the potential for it to grow into something much larger, we started branching out into poetry and novels, short stories, essays, and things like that. My training is in philosophy, so to speak with any sort of authority on literature, I felt it necessary to start creating literary criticism modules, and you'll see that on the updated version of the app, or if you're listening, watching this 5 years in the future or whatever, you're well acquainted with them already. So this is the first in that series. Let me say something about where this conversation will pick up when I do the splice. All I need to say here is that the conversation kicks off with Barthes zeroing in on Balzac's Sarrazin, and there's a particular passage in Sarrazin where a castrato disguises himself as a woman, and Balzac waxes poetically about the essence of femininity in this passage. Barthes sees this passage as being problematic because it can be read on a number of levels in regards to personality, which you'll find out in the conversation. And the conclusion that Barthes ultimately wants to get at is that there really isn't an authorial intent to be found. He'll develop this idea throughout the essay, but that's all I'll say for right now because I don't want to give away the store. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with CJ Eller. I hope you enjoyed immensely. Please download the Noetic app. All right. Is that Barthes can't seem to locate the voice of the person that is writing this. Typically, we would say, "Well, that's Balzac talking," but
there's so many others.
Yeah,
could be.
He talks about there being I identified at least 4 sources of who it could be. Do you know any off the top of your head?
Sure. I mean, it could be universal wisdom, like you said. It could be Balzac himself, professing the literary ideas on femininity. It could even be romantic psychology in some respect. So at least those are the 3 that I noticed.
I just to tease that out a little bit more, it could be the story's naive hero who doesn't recognize that the castrato is dressed up as a woman. It could be, like you were saying earlier, Barthes' particular romantic psychology in his relation to women, right? Yeah. Are these his personal experiences that are allowing him to pontificate on the nature of woman?
Or even the capital R romantic in regards to that literary era. Yeah.
Right, and so this leads Barthes to say, and we'll meditate on this passage here. We shall never know, for the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. And this is so strange, right? Like we'll see how all these pieces fit together, but trying to think about like the fact that like there is no one behind the text, that there is no author, is something that doesn't really appeal to our intuitions. We have, for a multitude of reasons, and I'll list them here, and maybe you'll identify some of them too, Barthes thinks that we've been inculcated with this modern construct of what the author is. That there is actually this godlike voice buried beneath the text that everyone has to exhume to really know what the authorial intent of the essay, the writing, the story, whatever the thing is under consideration. He talks about what some of the sources for that mythical construction of the author. Do you know some of them off the top of your head?
Well, at least one is a development of the human person or of the individual. If we think of rationalism or any kind of... I almost think of enlightenment, even though Barthes doesn't mention it. But this idea of the individual taking a higher role in how we go about in the world, that it's the human person that matters in some respect. That's at least the big one for me. And when we infuse that into art or into literary writing, then we have some person that is responsible for a text. And that everything, as he'll say later, everything about the merit of a certain work is based on that person. He even mentions, Van Gogh's work either is bad because he's mad in some respect, or it's great because he is a genius. So it all goes back to the person, and I think one part of that that everything goes back to the individual, that the individual is responsible for what he is doing in the world.
Yeah, you hit on a lot of these contributing sources to the construction of the person.
So what's another one?
So I think you hit one of three that Bart enumerates, and that was French rationalism. Yeah. The other two are English empiricism and the Reformation. Now, maybe we should tease that out a little bit. I mean, why might we consider French rationalism? Maybe he has Descartes in mind there, the cogito ergo sum. Yeah, I think therefore I am. The Reformation with the emphasis on the individual's relationship with Christ. And English empiricism, maybe that man has the rational faculty to come and understand the entire cosmos and universe.
But it seems to all come back down to the individual is the foci for anything, and then we're going to push that into art and understanding literature.
The God loves the person, that mine is this indefatigable resource for understanding the entire world. And he thinks it's sort of natural on page 143. It is thus logical that in literature it should be this positivism, the epitome and culmination of capitalist ideology, which has attached the greatest importance to the person or the author. So there is this fascination, this relatively modern fascination with this being behind the writing. I don't think he thinks that it was always there with us, like in Greek tragedy or something like that this is something that evolved over time, and maybe you could work some Nietzsche into this.
Yeah, I mean, it even goes back to the idea of like a shaman, or that there is a mediator between the narrative effect that he mentions earlier, I think on 142, at least the second paragraph, where he says, it wasn't always this way, like you said, that even in ethnographic storytelling, we have this performance or this mediator of this genius, but it's not them that's the genius. They're not the author per se. They're more so a mediator behind this. They're never admired as the author themselves, but it's the story or the narrative, the words that are admired rather than the person.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I if you guys are interested, we put a seminar together on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy that explores
touches on that.
That explores that there might be not sort of a singular author that is generating all of these things. In fact, that might be this might be in harmony with some of his criticisms of playwrights, such as I believe he criticized Euripides and Sophocles. Did he not, in Greek tragedy? Something like that. I have to revisit it, but Bart is optimistic that this tyrannical view, this obsession with the author as buried beneath the text, like the grip on our fascination has been loosened. And he cites, I believe, maybe 5 sources for what has loosened it. Individuals that I had to do a little study up on.
Sure. So the first one he mentions is the poet Stefan Mallarmé.
Yes.
As the first guy. Can you go into a little detail, maybe of like how he found Mallarmé as a person to try to take the sway away from the author?
I don't know enough about Mallarmé. I just found a nice little YouTube clip that I tagged you in on Facebook of Merleau-Ponty talking about Mallarmé. This is my first exposure really to him.
Sure, but what did Barthes say about
what do you thought Stéphane Mallarmé, is that how you say his name?
That's how I pronounce his last name.
Yeah. What he found so good about Mallarmé is that he emphasized the fact that the language is doing the performance rather than the individual. Now, we'll have to get into that a little bit later on. That was mystifying to me when I first read this. Like, why would we shift the onus of performance from language? Like, how do we shift performance onto language? Like, language isn't a person. Like, things perform things. Like, language doesn't have any sort of agency. But that's just something we should discuss as we progress.
He'll bring it up.
Yeah, it will come up again, and we'll have to talk about whether or not that is a right or a wrong-headed way of seeing things.
Yeah, and maybe a way to put it, as he puts it, he says, Mallarmé's entire poetics consists in suppressing the author in the interest of writing, which is, as will be seen, to restore the place of the reader.
Yeah, which we will dwell on a great deal.
Yeah, which might go into your idea of, okay, so if it's all on the words, then like the words don't do anything, but it might be the reader that does something.
Right. So then the second source is this. I don't know how familiar you are.
Paul Valery?
Yeah, why don't you say something about Paul Valery?
Well, he's a fascinating figure. At least he's contemporary, at least around the same time as Stéphane Mallarmé. And he's fascinating in the sense that he is a poet, but he also has a lot of nonfiction. And I haven't read much on him, honestly, but I know he's extensive, at least in those two fields, and he was a contemporary, at least of Mallarmé, or at least was drinking from the same fountain around that time. And it seems as if Barthes has a positive and then sort of negative view of what he was doing in some sense, but he still says that he always tried to call into question the author in some way, and in that he, as Barthes will say, he stressed the linguistic and, as it were, hazardous nature of his activity, and throughout his prose works he militated in favor of the essentially verbal condition of literature, in the face of which all recourse to the writer's inferiority seemed to him pure superstition.
Yeah.
So in some sense that, like you said, it goes back to the performance, the words. It all goes back to the words, and that the poet or the writer, this God being, is in some way not that important. We just got to push it aside as superstition, as he says.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to any of that, and I think you wonderfully explicated who Paul Valery is, because I wasn't very familiar.
I need to read more of him. He's very fascinating.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is Barthes notes that Valery and Mallarmé had their differences and oftentimes locked horns, but I don't really know the quintessence of the disputes that they engaged in. So the third source that diminished the importance of the author was Proust, Marcel Proust. And it's quite simple, from what I understand, is how Barthes has presented it. And I haven't read a lot of Proust. I mean, everyone, I think, who's listening...
It's big enough to be like,
yeah, I think everyone who knows...
Search of Lost Time might be like too much time.
Yeah, I'm really... But essentially what Proust did, by having such a multiplicity of characters and by sort of channeling parts of himself into so many of these different characters, there's no real authorial intent to be found. It's like he's too mixed up in too many of the people that have come to be personifications or manifestations in these things. I guess there must be novels that are really crowded with characters. I don't know.
And again, too, I mean, we're talking about a book that is so, or at least if we're talking about Proust, or we're thinking about like In Search of Lost Time, or any of those, like his like Oeuvre, which is like that masterwork, which is so big. And like sometimes when you read, at least for me, when I read a big book, and maybe it's the same with you, like a big book of fiction, which is like, up to like 800, 900,000 pages, that density in some way takes up so much of your mind that you can't really wrap yourself around one character or one event, that it almost washes over you. And maybe that is the effect, like you said, that it's just this wash. You're trying to pick out the one strand, but there's so many different strands, it's like picking a needle out of a haystack, and it's almost close to impossible.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to do a little comparative literature between, like, I don't know, like a Russian novelist and Proust to see, like, because, you know, Russian novels, like I think Tolstoy and War and Peace, there's like, I don't know, I think there are, they have to have a whole, like, ancestral genealogies to keep all the characters straight, but yet maybe Tolstoy can still preserve the authorial intent, whereas Proust was not interested in doing that. But that's a topic for another day. The fourth source of the criticism of the author I found to be the most compelling. It's the one that made the most sense to me because I have encountered work like this. Barthes says surrealism also undid the myth of the author by allowing the hand to write faster than the head and disappointing us with an arrived-at meaning. So essentially, I guess the idea in surrealism was just to scroll as fast as you can, not even really understand the words that are coming out of your being. And he calls this automatic writing.
There's a great little bit or performance by the poet Tristan Tzara, who in some way, I don't know if I can't remember if he was Dada or surrealist, but to me, Dada and surrealism sort of kind of commingle, but it talks about this idea of automatic writing where he stood up, he ripped up all these different papers that had words on it, put it in a hat, took them out, one by one read them, and that was his poem.
Yeah.
So in a sense where you take out the personality, you take out your taste, you take out your quote-unquote authorship, and you create this automatic writing. That to me is an analogy, or at least an example of automatic writing that I find quite compelling, where you leave it up to chance or you have some kind of operation that removes authorship because you're not the one doing it. It's the language or it's the system that's doing it.
Yeah, presumably there's all sorts of automatic writings. I hadn't thought of that example, which is a wonderful example, and you're really complimenting everything that I've prepared for tonight in a way that I couldn't have anticipated. Like, this is really wonderful.
Cool.
But you know, I just love the idea of, like, the words kind of just being enjoyable sounds that a writer puts together. That they're not really trying to concretize any sort of abstract, rational, systematic thing. Like, that it's really about how, like, kind of just what is going on in that eternal moment. That presentism of the author, and then leaving it behind. Yeah, and being like, like whoever did that no longer is here. The other thing that he said that surrealism did was that I guess, and I don't, you know, I'm not versed enough in literature to know an example off the top of my head, but maybe you would, is that there were people that were trying to challenge this concept of the author so that multiple individuals would engage in the authorship of a work. So you couldn't really establish authorial intent if you have, like, 5 people writing the book, right? And sort of challenge this, like, godlike character that is the author. Any examples come to mind for you?
There's this other French poetry group. I can't remember their name exactly, but they looked at poetry almost in a scientific, mathematical way, and they almost looked at poetry as creating ideas about poetry, but not exactly following through with it. And I know they had certain systems that they've all kind of collaborated on and they put in a certain work and whatnot, but I don't know if there's any authorship claimed, but it's just the group. You can almost think of like a band. And I can't remember the name of that, but I know like if you almost think of it like as a band where it's like the collective rather than the individual, like some kind of poetry collective. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was just thinking about it, you know, on camera here, so I don't know if these are good examples, but presumably ancient texts. I mean, the Bible is not written by one person.
Or think of
the Odyssey or something like that. Maybe that conceivably has more than one author since it was passed down and people contributed to it. Yeah. I know we do have a classicist off camera who might be able to weigh in on that matter. Did I get that right, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, it's like oral traditions.
Yeah. Or I almost think of architecture if you think of the chart, you know, like that big church in France. There's no architect. Like it's an anonymous work, but we can assume it's been made by many hands. But it's just this gorgeous thing that if we were to find something that would, you know, memorialize us, that would be it. This thing that doesn't have a name or any kind of authorship to speak of. It's just this great church. You know?
Yeah.
To keep with the French stuff.
Yeah. And I think I've already sort of tipped my hand a little bit as to what I think is the fifth major dethronement of the author, and this is the movements made in linguistics.
Yeah.
Which maybe you could say, we did a little bit of studies of semiotics and things like that, so maybe Barthes could be properly seen within this context. But he says on page 145, linguistically, the author is never more than the instance writing. Just as I is nothing other than the instance saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person, and this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together. Suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. And we saw this last week. You guys can check this out on the Noetic app. We looked at Borges and I, and our good friend Lindsay O'Connor pointed out that we were perhaps dancing all around these ideas of Barthes in that exploration of problematically understood identity. So that, I thought that was kind of interesting. That we were talking about how in the Borges illustrates that we don't know that difference between who is the crystallized public author, who is this I, and even at the end, Borges doesn't know who's writing it, because who CJ thinks he is and who Luke thinks he is and all these other individuals, these are Freudian sort of constructions of like this superego writing on top of what this pure being of conscience.
Yeah, there's this wonderful
consciousness, I should say.
There's this wonderful line from another French poet who was a young firebrand named Arthur Rimbaud around this time, and he said or wrote, "I is someone else." In that regards, where it's just like I is, as he says, is nothing other than the instance of saying I. And I think it was later in the same letter that Rimbaud says, well, I think it's pretty much I am thought in some regards, or I am this conglomeration of experiences, of thoughts, like I am thought. So I think it sort of removes this idea of any kind of identity in some regards, and that's what Barthes is doing, is just displaying that all of this identity we can get from language, or at least from a literary work, is something else. The author is something else, is someone else. It's not what's there. Yeah.
Now, I have to say, I don't know if these criticisms on their own are withering enough for me to surrender the idea that there isn't an essential Jordan or CJ or Luke or something like that. But that's sort of beside the point.
No,
the point is, how does this make us reinterpret the novel? How does this make us reinterpret writing? And what we have to do now is kind of maybe juxtapose the new view with the old view. And so the old view, right, the previous view was that if this was Luke's book, right? Like if this was, I labored, I poured my being into this. I existed prior to it. I exist after it. My being cannot be contained in this book, but I gave birth to it, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what Bart says. Yeah, there's this line of time, and that we have Luke before the book, and he toils and he thinks and he suffers for it and he lives for it. And then there's the book, and then there's after the book.
Right.
And then it has you on a single line. But then Barthes introduces this other view, which doesn't have the author. And what is that?
The new one, right?
Yeah, what is the new one? Yeah, what is the trajectory then?
Well, everything that we've said before is that we have to stop saying I. We have to stop looking for Borges. We have to stop looking for Luke. And we have to stop looking for CJ. That any sort of saying, well, I did this or I was after that, like really you just sort of get lost in the process. And the only thing that's really there is that there's this eternal here and now. There's nothing outside of that.
Yeah, and to quote Barthes on page 145, going exactly what you're going with. In complete contrast, the modern scripture is born simultaneously with the text. It is in no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing. It is not the subject with the book as predicate. There is no other time than that of the Annunciation, and every text is eternally written here and now.
Now, that all sounds very nice and very poetic, but I still don't know how convincing it is. I still want to hold on to our identities. Sure. So it's like, because even if there there's only this being that's at the moment scribbling down these things, like I don't know if that's really like there's still an agent pushing that pencil or striking the typewriter. So what else could it be? He goes on to give this. He posits this understanding of what the author really is, right? And what the author really is just a mishmash of writings, like a bunch of and that if I were to be a writer, or Borges or Marcus Aurelius or anybody else, like they're just kind of pushing around different symbols, different ideas, different cultural appropriations and things like that, and it's just kind of a different recombination.
Yes, exactly.
Of things.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think he uses a great example of Thomas de Quincey, who is this one fantastic English writer around, I want to say maybe 19th, 18th century, something like that. I can't remember. But he quotes it by saying that Thomas de Quincey was this guy that knew Greek really, really well. So well that he was able to take all these modern ideas and images that he had and was able to translate them in this dead language. So Eller tells us, and to quote him on page 146, that Thomas de Quincey created for himself an unfailing dictionary, vastly more extensive and complex than those resulting from the ordinary patience of purely literary themes. That he's able to take this language, this dead language of Greek, and able to translate it into what he was thinking, or not what he was thinking, but of certain ideas he wanted to, it sucks to say even like certain ideas that he wanted to express, but he is drawing from this dictionary of words.
Yeah, he uses a couple different metaphors to describe it.
Yeah.
The one that I particularly liked is on page 146. He says the text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture.
Yeah.
And then going on with this dictionary thing, he ought at least to know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words, and so on indefinitely. Now, that rings true on a certain level, right? Like, you guys are looking at Marcus Aurelius and putting together a seminar on that. You guys can see the different influences of, like, Epictetus the Stoic, maybe some Platonism that gets filtered into this, and that Marcus Aurelius maybe is just sort of recombining a bunch of different influences. And I myself can relate to that to some degree, like especially when I'm really just communicating the thoughts of other individuals. Like I'm not really adding, I'm hopefully translating it into a new medium and putting it into words that people find understandable, but like I'm not really adding a lot of creative originality to it. So I get that. I get how, like, I'm working off a script. Like, if you can see this, I am literally working off a script. I've got my script right here in front of me.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you and I are both musicians, or I once was one. Right. I don't know if it's fair to call myself one anymore. I'm done with that, Luke. But that I is gone.
Right.
He's buried. But there were very, very meaningful points of breakthrough where I did think, at least in the realm of music, I made new insights. And there are big jumps in philosophy where individuals seem to have this penetrating grasp of some other realm. It doesn't seem just to be like a rearranging of other people's writings.
Right. But then Bart would maybe argue too that what you were doing, like those breakthroughs were just in your dictionary, but you haven't used them yet. That maybe you've heard these ideas in some way, or you've stockpiled them, but you haven't put it into writing, or it wasn't put into action yet, that they weren't necessarily a new thing that happened, that what you did, that breakthrough in your drumming, was simply something that you've heard already, or at least internalized in your dictionary, in your musical dictionary of moves and certain idiosyncrasies and styles, and you're just able to put it in a maybe new context.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I used to obsess about consuming as much music as possible so I could have some sort of recombination.
What kind of database do you have? And perhaps some things would happen that you've forgotten that influence, but you take it as something original. And I think that's what Barthes is in some way saying. I think that there's nothing new under the sun, and that everything is almost just kind of a mashup of certain ideas and thoughts.
So are these words that I'm speaking right now not my own?
Exactly right. That seems to be the conclusion. Damn it!
What is speaking?
Foiled again.
Yeah, what is speaking through me?
Yeah.
So
let's talk about the idea, like, once the author is removed, because this almost kind of brings a damper on what we're doing, right? Because once the author is removed, as Bart says, like, the claim to decipher a text becomes close to nil. It becomes futile. We can't exactly decipher a text if there's no author at the middle of it.
Right. And so if the author dies, who else dies with the author?
Yeah, I mean, the critic or the
critic.
Yeah.
Because now the critic is superfluous, right? The critic is no longer needed to exhume the author from beneath his text.
Yeah. So why does the critic need an author?
Well, I think the people have looked to the critic as some sort of oracle to tell me what the
author says,
what the book is about. But Barthes actually, and he says, like, that he loves the fact that the critic is experiencing the demise with the author as well, because in that move something anti-theological happens. He says on page 147. An activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix meaning is in the end to refuse God and his hypostasis, reason, science, law. So
it's such a revolutionary act. Yeah.
So by killing the author, we're also killing off reason, science. We don't need to turn to a critic any longer to read the Bible for us. Like, just as priests who understood Latin could tell the common people what the words of God were, we no longer need that intermediary. We can enter into a direct relationship with the text. We don't need someone on high telling us what to think. And so this leads to the idea: if the death of the author and the critic occur, is there only downside, or is there the generation or birth of something else?
Sure, and maybe we have to go in a little further with the death of the critic too, because I think that also means, in some respect, the death of a negative thing. I mean, when I think of a critic or an expert, sometimes I also think of negative connotations. If we think of the idea of art critics or experts of a certain field, if we think about forgery, that in some respect, forgery is based upon the idea that there's an author of a certain work or a certain piece of art that has certain nuances that a critic deciphers and treats as the thing. So if somebody is able to copy that certain idiosyncrasy of a painter, of an author, and that a critic is able to see that idiosyncrasy and say, that's Picasso, then we have a whole other field of forgery in some respect. That because we have an art market, because we have this identity with an author, with a painter, we also have this field of criminality and of forgery and all of that too, in some respect. So if we take the emphasis of the author away, of the work, of that being the focus, then perhaps we take away the idea of theft, and that there in a sense is no theft. There's nothing to steal because everything is open and free in some regard. Yeah. Which is pretty crazy.
Yeah, we can get rid of hacks.
Yeah.
What did I want to say? What's kind of interesting here, right, is that, and I have to ask, is the critic really experiencing a downfall as well, right? Uh-huh. I find it sort of ironic because we're asking this question about what the author is, right? Yeah. The author is this person hiding behind a particular writing. And if the critic is the one that is sort of exhuming the author and bringing it for all to see, I guess the question is, who is Barthes? Who are we, right? Is Barthes a critic, or is he just a mere mishmash of words and ideas? Are you and I right now, are we critics? Mm-hmm. Or have we been killed along with the author, and everybody should see us for the hacks that we are, and we're just kind of recombining other people's ideas?
Well, let's take a little bit from Barthes here and see if maybe that will create a new role. So he says, In the multiplicity, and this is 147 in that same little bit about the critic. In the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. The structure can be followed, run like the thread of a stocking, at every point and at every level, but there is nothing beneath. The space of writing is to be ranged over, not pierced.
He can't help but be erotic, can he? He always goes back to the tear of the stocking.
No, but in a sense where we almost become surveyors rather than actual people that take something and get at the essence of. We're not drilling into the ground here. We're merely surveying the surroundings that we have, and like you said, maybe distangling and finding the individual parts that make up this greater whole, or maybe thinking about them. We're not necessarily saying, oh, Beethoven is this.
Yeah.
Perhaps he's describing an idea of like, okay, maybe it's not like Beethoven is a genius because this, and this. Maybe an example of a text would be like, oh, these are the historical connotations and conditions that Beethoven lived in that may or may have not contributed to his quote-unquote genius or to the works that he created. That you're trying to survey the bigger scope of things rather than trying to say that this is the author or that this is the reason why this person is a genius. It's just disentangling and seeing things as they are rather than like deciphering things.
Well, we want to be careful about seeing things as they are, because it seems like what happens with the diminishing status of the author is that the upshot is that the reader gains a significant importance. And this idea is really not that new to me. I believe that you and I did. We've done so much, but we did. Did we do the Kierkegaard's on 3 Imagined Occasions? We did, yes. Right? Yes, we did. We did those together. And remember, at the beginning of each of those discourses, he says that what's going on here is sort of a communication between author and reader, and the experience of the text is the phenomenon itself, right? It's not just the book; it's like what you take away from it. Mm-hmm. And he says here that ultimately the significance of the reader is the upshot of this whole critique. Mm-hmm. The reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. Mm-hmm. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. So that's why I said maybe want to hold back on that seeing things as they are, because if you and I read Nabokov's Pale Fire, presumably the subjective experience that you have of it will be different from mine. Sure. Right? And that's kind of this beautiful thing. I notice it in like how like you and I approach text together and something like that. Like you're much better at this than I am. Like you are really dialed into this sort of thing. Whereas when I do philosophy stuff, I'm constantly trying to figure out what Kierkegaard and what Kant said. Mm-hmm. And you're much more comfortable, I think, with the subjective sort of nuance of things. And it's actually super uncomfortable for me to study stuff like this. Like,
why is it uncomfortable? Does it just bring out something that you're just like can you go against?
Because philosophy is just a whole discipline based on there not being ambiguity. Yeah. The philosophy has this fixation with being science. Yeah. Philosophy has this fixation with being true and right and being an accurate description of the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what makes for a really good dynamic between you and I, is that different interpretive lenses that we bring to text. Yeah. Like you bring a little bit more of a literary mind to the philosophical stuff, and maybe I'll bring philosophy stuff to the literary stuff. These are false designations.
No, but it's interesting that Barthes is bringing both of that into this text right here, because he's going at it very structurally or scientifically, like he's lifting the veil of the author in some respect, but yet it leaves so much ambiguity. So it's almost as if he is coming at it from a scientist literary point of view. It's a very odd mixture.
So I asked the ironic question. Did Barthes get it right?
Yeah.
Right? So
was it all true? Is the author dead?
Yeah. Right. So this is a really wonderful read, and I enjoyed our conversation about it. But if we affirm Barthes, are we doing exactly what he doesn't want us to do? Like,
right.
Like if we ascribe, if I'm like, yes, it makes perfect philosophical coherence and this makes sense and whatever, have I re-instilled the supremacy of Barthes as author or critic when really these things should be dead to us now?
Right. Well, I think I keep on going back to the idea that we have to try to maybe become more surveyors rather than oilmen, if you want to call it that way. That we're not drilling, at least in Barthes' view, we're not supposed to be drilling oil, trying to get the succulence of truth, the oil of objectivity from these texts, but we're trying to see the multiplicity of what they are, which is all of these different influences and ideas that are wrapped into one thing. I mean, I think on page 146 he says, like, we know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, but a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. That if we can in some way be a surveyor of that node where all of these different angles and dimensions clash, then in some way that can be a beautiful experience. I mean, if we think of people that are naturalists, naturalist writings or things like that, the people that just survey the world, survey birds, like bird watching or something like that, there is some beauty to that and some complexity in the observations that are fascinating and in some way enlightening and spiritual. And that perhaps maybe Barthes is saying, like, if we look at literary analysis in that way, then perhaps we can glimpse at writing as this more complex thing than that's it.
Well, I have to defer to you because this is really my first foray into literary criticism.
Sure.
I have to ask you, are we supposed to take each of these essays or each of these books on literary criticisms as sort of works of art in themselves? So what Barthes has said here is not necessarily the gospel truth about how we're to interpret every single piece of writing that comes across us, but just a merely fascinating, interesting think piece on the nature of writing. And then we'll read Foucault, or we'll read some other theorists that I don't even know their names, right? We'll read them and we'll just go, well, that was beautiful. That was a beautiful critique. And where the critique isn't so much getting at truth, but it's just this beautiful occasion that we experience. I don't know.
That's interesting because that's throwing Barthes on himself, right?
Right.
That's exactly what you're doing right there. You're saying, okay, well, let me look at this text as a node for which many things, this multiplicity of meanings and ideas plop on, and if I can maybe see certain, maybe another way to look at it is I almost look at it like how we described Kierkegaard in a lot of our discussions as this sculpture, and we're looking at different angles and seeing different views and getting the light and putting some light on there, and then maybe dimming the lights over here, and then maybe getting really far away, and then getting really close, then looking at his armpit, and then looking up, and then maybe climbing on him and looking down, and all these different angles that perhaps it's more, again, I gotta go back to the surveyor idea of just walking around on the dirt and feeling around and, scratching at the ground, like we're not really getting at it. We're not like saying like, this is Kierkegaard, but we're saying, oh, look at all these different angles of Kierkegaard. Oh, look at this. Oh, this angle matches this angle here. Oh, wait, if you get a little farther, you can see that angle there is a little more, I don't know, coherent with all these other angles, and that maybe that's what Barthes is getting at. We're disentangling things and views and ideas. We're not deciphering at them. We're not trying to get at truth, but we're trying to get at maybe a larger truth, that there's many truths. I'm not really sure. I'm just making this stuff on the fly.
Well, you know what we should do? We should get my lawyers on this, and we should trademark this a Eller Johnson joint venture, and then we should go and write this book about this meta literary criticism, because I'm sure we're the first people ever to consider it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And we read one literary theory essay, and we're like, oh, got it all figured out.
No, but it's wonderful because it makes you think about writing. I mean, I think that's the great thing about this text, because it makes me look at authorship in a different way for many different mediums, not even just literature, but for music, or for sculpture, or for fine arts, or for dance. It can make you think about the world differently, and that's one thing I enjoy with any thinker or any text. If it can make you view the world in a different way, or what you encounter in a different way, and make you really grapple with it, I mean, I think that's wonderful. And that's what Barthes is doing to me right now.
Right. So I think it's a very plausible, interesting theory to talk about how the different perspectives of the person have changed, so that we have a different receptivity to text.
Sure.
Which I'm totally down with. What I'd want to ask you is, like, does this convince you at all that who C.J. Eller is doesn't really exist? Do you think it's compelling for you to relinquish your I, spelled with the letter I, not E-Y-E-I?
I want to keep this.
I don't want to pluck out. I don't want to pluck out your I. I want to pluck out your conscience, your superego.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's compelling in that way?
I think it is in some degree. I mean, I go back to the Rimbaud quote where it's like, I is someone else. That what I am is this conglomeration of different opinions, people's thoughts, different receptions of certain things, and I don't really know if I have a certain identity, I suppose, in that respect, as an author, as a thinker, or a writer, or anything like that, but I've never really thought of it much, and in some respect it is. I mean, again, it goes back to the idea, like, this being like a truly revolutionary idea, because then it's like you refute the idea of these things that are, like as he says, like, you refuse God, and then in doing that you refuse reason, science, law, that you refute these things that are, in a sense, trying to decipher. Like, when I think of reason, law, science, they're deciphering, and if you say, well, there isn't really an author, or there isn't really something that you can decipher, then you're dismissing that. And I suppose I have to realize that when I say, like, I don't really know if there is that person. Like, if I think Barthes is right, I have to upend that statement that what you're saying, CJ, is quite revolutionary, or like revolutionary, not in the sense of like you're so original, but like you're revolting against these things. So I'm not really sure. It's really hard to say, but yeah.
Do you mind if I close with a joke?
Do it.
All right. So I'm glad that you're experiencing this sort of ambiguity, or you might even be agreeing with Bart, because the next time, like, I say I'm going to pick up the tab, like, you really are. Something to that effect, right? Okay. Also, I don't know if that was a good joke.
No.
Yeah, I think it had the intellectual nucleus. I don't know. It maybe lacked in execution.
No, I liked it.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to close with? All right. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll have more content for you soon. Download the Noetic app. Bye.